It was a perfect summer afternoon. The sun was shining brightly, the sound of children's laughter filled the air, and the warm breeze brushed gently against Marcus's face as he sat by the pool, watching his kids, Jaden and Ava, splash and play. His wife, Lisa, sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee, both of them enjoying the peacefulness of the day. Jaden had just cannonballed into the water, sending a wave of splashes toward Ava, who squealed with laughter as she tried to dodge the water. Marcus smiled, his heart full. It was moments like this, simple, joyful moments, that he cherished the most. His family was everything to him. But then, a sharp voice pierced through the air, shattering the peace. "Excuse me? What do you think you're doing?" Marcus turned, confused. Standing at the edge of the pool was a middle-aged white woman, Karen, stomping toward them, her face scrunched in disapproval. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, as if she were already prepared for a confrontation. "This is a private pool for residents only," Karen said, her tone full of condescension. Marcus's confusion deepened. He had never had a problem at the pool before, and they had been coming here for months. He looked over at Lisa, who was already standing up, her expression hardening at the rude interruption. Lisa, unfazed, reached into her bag and pulled out their key card, holding it up toward Karen. "We are residents," she said firmly, her voice calm but assertive. Karen scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "I doubt that," she said with a sneer, taking a step closer. "People like you don't live here." The words stung like a slap, but Marcus stayed calm. His heart raced with anger, but he wasn't going to let this woman get under his skin. He looked at Lisa, who kept her composure as she placed the key card back into her bag. They were paying residents, just like everyone else. They belonged here. But Karen wasn't done. She wasn't just going to let the family enjoy their day without further interruption. She stood there, glaring at them, her body language hostile. The situation was already escalating, and it wasn't even noon yet. Marcus tried to remain calm, but his fists clenched at his sides. The injustice of the situation hit him like a wave, but he took a deep breath, refusing to let this woman provoke him any further. His kids were still playing in the pool, oblivious to the tension, but Marcus knew things were about to get worse. "Look, lady," Marcus said, keeping his voice even, his eyes locked on Karen. "We live here. Now please, let my kids enjoy their day." Karen, however, was beyond reason. A smirk spread across her face, and she reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, tapping the screen with a sense of triumph. "Oh, I'm calling the police," Karen declared, her voice dripping with venom. "Let's see if you're really supposed to be here." Lisa shook her head in disbelief, frustration welling up inside her. "Are you serious?" she shot back, her voice rising in indignation. It was one thing for Karen to question them, but to call the police over something this trivial? It was beyond the pale. Karen turned her glare on Lisa, but her focus shifted quickly to the children. Her eyes narrowed as she looked down at them, her disdain palpable. "You people always cause trouble," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm not letting my neighborhood turn into a ghetto." The words cut deep, but Marcus didn't flinch. He kept his composure, but he could feel the anger simmering just below the surface. His kids, now watching this unfold, looked confused and frightened. Jaden's eyes were wide with uncertainty, and Ava clung to her mother, sensing the tension. A crowd had started to gather, attracted by the commotion. Some watched in silence, others exchanged whispers, but no one stepped in to help. The scene grew increasingly uncomfortable, and Marcus could feel the eyes of the onlookers judging him, as if he were the one causing a disturbance. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't long before a police car pulled up in front of the pool, the flashing lights casting a stark glow across the scene. Karen stood taller, almost proud of herself for having summoned the police. She glanced at Marcus, then at the officer as he got out of his car. The moment he stepped onto the pavement, her expression shifted, but she didn't back down. "Officers," Karen called out as they approached, "I've got a situation here. These people don't belong here, and I want them removed." The officer looked at her, his expression neutral, before turning to Marcus and Lisa, who stood quietly, their children by their side. Marcus's heart raced. This wasn't just about the pool. This was about his family being humiliated in public, about a white woman trying to control the space that didn't belong to her. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, his children, his dignity, everything on the line. The officer took a step toward them, looking at their faces, then back to the pool, seemingly weighing the situation. The whole atmosphere felt wrong. The crowd had quieted down, some eyes still on Marcus and his family, some still watching Karen. Would the police side with her, or would they recognize what was truly happening here? Time seemed to stand still, the air heavy with anticipation. Karen stood there, a look of triumph on her face, as the police officer walked toward Marcus and his family. She had called the cops, and she thought this was the moment she would win. She was about to have them removed from what she considered her neighborhood. She had humiliated Marcus and his family in front of everyone, and she was sure she had the power to finish what she had started. "Officers," Karen said, pointing toward Marcus and his family, "remove these trespassers." Her voice was filled with self-satisfaction, as though the fight was already won. She had called in the police, and surely the situation would be handled. But what Karen didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just any person. He wasn't someone she could bully or dismiss, and he wasn't about to let her get away with it. The officer walked over to Marcus, his eyes scanning the family. There was a brief moment of tension before the officer spoke calmly, though his gaze was sharp. "Sir," the officer said, his voice steady, "do you live here?" Marcus held his ground, a small smirk playing on his lips. He wasn't going to let Karen see how much her behavior had gotten under his skin. He knew exactly how to turn this around. "Yes, officer," Marcus replied smoothly. "In fact, my name is Marcus Anderson." Karen's expression faltered just slightly, confusion crossing her face. She had assumed she was in control, but now her smirk was beginning to fade. "So?" she scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain, trying to reassert her power over the situation. She couldn't quite grasp what was happening, but the officer's demeanor shifted almost immediately. His eyebrows shot up as recognition hit him. "Wait," the officer said, his voice growing slightly more serious. "Marcus Anderson? As in the Marcus Anderson?" Marcus nodded once, still calm and composed. Karen's face shifted from smug superiority to an expression of confusion, her mind trying to piece everything together, but the realization hadn't quite dawned on her yet. The officer quickly turned his attention back to Karen, his eyes narrowing as he processed what had just been revealed. "Ma'am," the officer began, his tone firm, "you just called the cops on the president of this entire homeowners association." The words hit like a thunderclap. The truth of what Marcus had just revealed crashed down on Karen like a wave. Her face drained of color in an instant. The realization that she had just made the gravest of mistakes, the kind that couldn't be undone, was written all over her face. The proud, defiant look she had worn moments before was replaced by one of pure shock. Her lips trembled as she looked from the officer to Marcus and back again, unable to find the words she needed. The people around them, who had been silently watching the exchange, now murmured in disbelief. Karen's earlier actions, her humiliation of an innocent family, now seemed even more absurd. She hadn't just crossed a line, she had stepped directly into a disaster of her own making. Marcus, still standing tall, didn't rub it in. He didn't need to. The power shift was palpable. He wasn't looking for revenge. He didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself. As Karen stood there, frozen in shock, Marcus couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had remained dignified throughout, and now it was clear who had the real authority here. The officer stood firm, his expression serious, waiting for Karen to process what had just happened. Karen, still reeling, could barely comprehend how badly she had misjudged this entire situation. She had assumed that just because Marcus and his family didn't fit into her narrow view of who should be in first-class areas, they didn't belong. But now, as the truth unfolded, she could see how terribly wrong she had been. The power dynamics had flipped entirely, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions. "Ma'am, I suggest you apologize," the officer said, his voice even but stern. But Karen was too stunned to speak. The words wouldn't come, and the weight of her own ignorance and prejudice was now settling in. The crowd, once divided in their attention, now turned toward her, their silent judgment filling the air. The entire situation had turned on its head. Marcus glanced at his family, his kids who had witnessed the entire ordeal, and offered a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't just about reclaiming his place at the pool, it was about showing them that they could stand up to injustice with dignity, without lowering themselves to the level of those who sought to belittle them. "Let's get back to enjoying our day," Marcus said, his voice calm, his eyes never leaving Karen's stunned face. With that, he turned to the officer. "Thank you for your professionalism," he added, his respect for the officer clear. As Marcus and his family made their way back to the pool, the scene they left behind was one of quiet realization. Karen remained frozen, unable to undo what had already happened. The crowd was silent now, no one willing to stand by her. And as the sun continued to shine brightly above, it felt like justice had been served, not with anger or confrontation, but with the undeniable truth that no one could take away the respect and dignity of a family, standing strong in the face of prejudice. Karen's mouth hung open, her face flushed with panic. Her mind raced as she tried to come up with an excuse, anything to get her out of this mess. But the words wouldn't come. She was caught. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no denying what she had done. "Shh! This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know," Karen stammered, her voice cracking with uncertainty. The officer, standing tall and firm, folded his arms across his chest, his expression unwavering. He had no sympathy for her stammering excuses. The wrong had been done, and it needed to be addressed. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice calm but authoritative, "you just racially profiled the head of the HOA and harassed his family." The crowd that had gathered started whispering among themselves. Phones were pulled out, recording the moment, capturing every word and gesture. They had seen enough. They had witnessed the blatant prejudice, and now they were capturing the moment when karma caught up with Karen. Karen's eyes darted around, her panic rising as she realized the full scope of her actions. The crowd, her once quiet supporters, were now silent. They were watching her, every slip-up, every word, waiting to see if she would try to wriggle her way out of it. With her back against the wall, Karen turned back to Marcus, her face pale, the last bit of confidence drained from her. "Marcus," she pleaded, her voice shaky, I didn't mean anything by it. You understand, right?" Marcus stood tall, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze never wavering from hers. His stance was firm, unyielding, as if he had already decided how this would end. "No, I don't," Marcus said, his voice quiet but resolute. "You assumed because we're black, we didn't belong. Now you're scared because you got caught." The words hit like a ton of bricks. The air grew heavy, and for a moment, the only sound was the rustle of people's phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. Karen's face reddened further, and she stammered, unable to respond to the reality of her own actions. The officer nodded in agreement, his gaze turning to Marcus. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his tone neutral but laced with respect, "do you want to press charges for harassment?" Karen's eyes widened in horror as the officer's words hit her like a freight train. She had crossed a line that couldn't be erased, and now the consequences of her actions were staring her in the face. The power had completely shifted in Marcus's favor, and Karen realized, too late, that her cruelty had just cost her everything. Without warning, Karen dropped to her knees, her face contorting with desperation. She was no longer the confident, entitled woman who had tried to humiliate a family. She was broken, begging for mercy, realizing that her actions had led her to the precipice of losing everything. "Please, no!" Karen pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. I'll lose everything! My job, my reputation, everything!" Her words echoed in the air, but no one was moved. She had made her bed, and now it was time to lie in it. The crowd watched, some shaking their heads, others filming every second. No one was coming to her defense. Marcus, still standing tall, watched Karen with a cool, calm demeanor. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no gloating. He wasn't enjoying this. He was simply standing in his truth, letting Karen face the consequences of her own actions. He knew the power he had in this moment, but he didn't need to say anything more. The officer looked at Marcus, waiting for a decision. It wasn't his call, but he wanted to ensure that Marcus felt empowered, that he was given the space to choose what happened next. Marcus stood there, still composed. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm and measured. "I'm not pressing charges," Marcus said, his words clear and final. "But I think she needs to learn a lesson about treating others with respect." The officer nodded, his demeanor respectful. He wasn't there to make a decision about the law. He was there to ensure that what had been wrong was set right. Karen, still on her knees, was a broken shell of the woman who had started this ordeal with so much confidence. She had assumed she could humiliate someone without consequence. But now, as the reality of the situation settled in, she realized just how wrong she had been. The crowd that had once stood silent was now speaking softly to one another, sharing their own silent judgment of her actions. As Marcus turned to walk back to the pool with his family, the weight of the moment lingered. He wasn't just walking away from Karen's humiliation. He was walking away from a moment of injustice that he had stood up to with dignity. This wasn't about winning a confrontation. This was about showing his family, showing the world, that standing up for what's right was worth far more than any petty victory. The crowd, still whispering, slowly started to disperse. No one would forget this moment, especially not Karen, who would now have to live with the consequences of her own prejudice. Marcus exchanged a look with Lisa, his eyes tired but resolute. He had been calm throughout the entire ordeal, but now, as the final decision loomed, he couldn't let Karen's actions go unaddressed. There was something more at stake here, not just his family's dignity, but the principle of justice. Finally, Marcus sighed, breaking the tense silence. "No, I won't press charges," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. Karen's face flooded with relief, the tightness in her chest loosening as she thought she had escaped without further consequence. She wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself, but the weight of her actions seemed to vanish from her face as the officer turned away. It felt like the storm was over, and she could finally breathe again. But then, Marcus spoke again, his words cutting through the air like a final verdict. "But I am reporting this to the HOA board," Marcus said, his tone unyielding. "And I'm revoking your pool access for the next year." Karen gasped audibly, her face blanching as the realization hit her hard. This wasn't over. Far from it. The consequences of her racist actions were about to come crashing down. "You can't!" she pleaded, her voice desperate and panicked. She stood up, trying to find some ground to hold on to, but it was too late. Marcus smiled, a knowing smile that reflected both the quiet power and calm dignity he had carried through the entire exchange. "I can, and I just did," Marcus said firmly, his words final. The decision had been made, and there was no going back for Karen now. The crowd, which had been silently watching the entire ordeal, erupted into cheers. The tension that had filled the air moments ago melted away. They had witnessed justice unfolding before their eyes, not in the form of anger or revenge, but through careful, deliberate action. Marcus hadn't just stood up for his family. He had made sure that the person responsible for the injustice was held accountable. Karen, overwhelmed by the sudden realization of the repercussions, burst into tears. Her sobs were loud and uncontrollable, her body shaking as she crumpled to the ground. The humiliation she had tried to inflict on others had now come back to haunt her in the most public and undeniable way. As the crowd's cheers continued, Marcus turned to Lisa, his face softening as he watched her approach him. She handed him a cold drink, her smile wide with pride. "Justice served?" she asked, a playful glint in her eyes as she sat down next to him. Marcus smirked, his gaze softening as he watched their kids, Jaden and Ava, laughing and splashing in the pool, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded just moments before. His family was safe, happy, and unburdened by the prejudice they had faced. "Oh yeah," Marcus said, his smirk turning into a satisfied smile. "Pool days just got a lot more peaceful." And with that, the family settled into the afternoon, the sun shining down on them, the warmth of the day now fully restored. Karen's drama was behind them, and the lesson had been learned, not just by Karen, but by everyone who had witnessed this moment of quiet strength and justice.